Pot roasts, soups, stews. Oh, the endless possibilities we can simply throw into the crock pot and forget about while we go on about our day. Think this sounds like a dream come true? Then hop on as we're getting into the best forgotten recipes made with crock pots. One of the finest dishes we ever got as a result of the crock pot was the famous Amish 6-layer dinner. Just like Kentucky Fried Chicken gets a lot of attention for those infamous 13 secret ingredients, this dish too only has 6 ingredients that make up all the magic. You have your onions, ground beef, carrots, tomatoes, and then a layer of seasoning and broth. You layer this up in a casserole dish, bake it until the vegetables are the definition of soft and tender, and enjoy the healthiest and tastiest casserole you've ever had. Simple does it, right? That advice has carried kings to their empires, and it'll carry you to a wonderful dinner if you take it. You don't need to pre-cook anything, as everything goes into one casserole. This dish gets the Amish association because, as you may have guessed, it got pretty popular in those communities and places with farming traditions. More people started adopting it when people had an interest in the many cuisines that different communities in America had, like the Amish and Midwestern traditions. The era where this dish got popular, the 1950s to 1970s, was a time marked by an increasing population and birth rate. People had larger families, and cheap, affordable ways to feed everyone were immediate hits with the masses. This is probably the best proof of how stress-free a crock pot can be. When your cooking gets so simple that your dish gets called no-peak chicken because you literally don't need to even glance at it, you know you need to invest in one of these bad boys. This dish takes chicken breasts and works some real magic with them, but the real star of this show is the canned products. Canned mushrooms and soups are put into a dish with a broth, then covered with foil and baked. The rice absorbs all the liquid, and the chicken soaks in that lovely flavor. It gets really mushy in the process, and that means it's perfect for you to sink your teeth into after a long day. It got popular because it was one of those dump and bake recipes. It took nothing. You wouldn't work up a sweat making it, and everything you needed for it was available at your nearest convenience store. Casserole culture in general started skyrocketing from the 1950s to the 1980s, and this was one of the staples of that time. It's a win-win situation for everyone when your country's classics are made even easier and more accessible thanks to nifty new machines, and people definitely took as much advantage of that fact as they could. We're going to continue the casserole show with Alpine Chicken. This one got popular for more or less the same reasons the other two did. However, it had an extra kick that they didn't, and that was the addition of Swiss cheese. Americans will never get tired of a dish if it has a decent helping of cheese in it. So you shouldn't be too surprised that this is stuck in the minds of eaters and families like glue. Alpine chicken typically uses cream of mushroom soup and breadcrumbs or a stuffing mix layered in a dish that gets cooked until the cheese is melted. You also have your typical chicken breasts involved, but some people go for the thighs. It peaked in popularity during the post-war era when people really started looking for more ease in their cooking rather than sweating buckets after a day in the kitchen. You know how when you cook something, you rarely feel like eating it immediately? It's because cooking is a soul-sucking endeavor. It doesn't have to be, thanks to things like crock pots and recipes like Alpine Chicken, which bring the fun back in food and make sure you actually get to rest and replenish that stamina tank. Plus, this was a dish that really got the crowd singing, and that's always one you want to keep on your roster. This dish actually got popular for exactly the reasons you would think. Yes, landing your man through a happy stomach is a good way to get married by fall season. Land your man, baked beans suddenly are a tried and tested method. I mean, you don't get a moniker like that for nothing, right? These typically get served as a topping for bratwurst or hot dogs, or served as a side for a main event that lies more on the barbecue side. The beans are made with ground beef, onions, and bell peppers, so they definitely are the perfect side to any kind of savory or tangy experience. One of the best sauces to use was Texas Pete sauce, but any kind of Tabasco works. If you have hardwood smoked bacon, though, that's definitely what cookbooks recommend, along with Taco Bell seasoning. As far as beans, any kind of canned beans work, but if you're looking for a specific recommendation that really encapsulates that mid-1900s flavor profile, Then you should go for Bush's original baked beans. Either way, you're in for a great time with these. Try making them for a special someone on a romantic evening, and maybe you might get lucky in other ways too. If you do hear wedding bells because of this dish, know you did a great job. Pork cassoulet was what you went for as far as everyday meals go if you wanted to work some pork into the weekly diet. Pork cassoulet featured pork shoulders, or sausages in particular, and some of the typical ingredients you're used to seeing with savory dishes. Tomatoes, onions, garlic, all your usual suspects. Except this time it uses white beans like Great Northern beans. The reason you ended a crock pot, particularly for this, is that it is a stew, and the pork needs to be browned. Now you can include breadcrumbs for a crunch on top, but it kind of messes with the stew-centric vibe, so people used to leave them out. As far as the flavor goes, this is all savory, and it does not hide that fact from you at all. The slow cooking really lets everything combine into one massive profile that feels like it's made up of many different flavors, instead of a lot of tastes fighting for which one gets to stand out the most. When this was popular, pork was leagues more affordable than it is today, and the fact that you could either make this into a stew or a casserole meant that a lot of families found a lot of use for it. It fit the tastes of almost every prolific area in the country, like California, the Pacific, or the South, and it did great at keeping everyone full. If we take a look at how Porcupine Meatballs made their claim to fame, then the answer is pretty easy, my friend. You take canned food, a sauce that gets simplified for everyday use, and budget-friendly, high-quality meatballs, and you have an easy winner in the eyes of the people. This dish costs nothing to make and requires the simplest of things from you. It's probably all stuff you already have in your home, to be honest. How often do we really find ourselves without any onions or rice? The sauce might be a bit tricky if you're new to it, but any canned tomato sauce would work too. All in all, it's extremely beginner-friendly. It caught on because between the casseroles, the meatloafs, and the pot roasts, people needed something different, but similar enough that it could work for them on a daily basis. What they ended up finding was porcupine meatballs, among many things, but the recipe is largely forgotten nowadays. You just don't get to see it being made much in households, probably because the prices are much higher than they used to be, and because there's been a massive rise in takeout culture on top of it all. Its golden days in the 1950s and 1970s are ancient history now. As far as everyday meals go, it gets pretty hard to outdo candied carrots if you're a middle-class home in the mid-1900s. As I'm sure many of you can relate to today as well, the little goblin in your brain that demands a sugar rush every other day for comfort is something humans throughout time have experienced. How did they get their fix? Well, you couldn't just get a caramel mocha frap from Starbucks like today, but you could take some carrots, boil them, and coat them in a glaze that was made from honey, maple syrup, brown sugar, and butter. Not really something that would suit the tastes of today, right? But don't knock it until you try it, because it actually did really well. Candied food was this entire niche genre of cooking back then that got popular. The whole glaze aspect was something people loved applying to every dish to see what sticks. These were a side dish that also worked for kids, so they got a lot of mileage out of family gatherings and dinner parties. But even besides that, it's still a great way to work some carrots into your diet. As far as the taste goes, they definitely hit home. It feels like any other treat you'd be eating, though when we think of candy today, we might be more used to hard and mushy textures like in hard licorice or sour candies. This was tender though, and it would melt in your mouth. So you know how America and pulled pork go together like jam on toast, right? After all, it's something you can feed a whole crowd and have them feeling full and satisfied. It's a showstopper, but you can make a lot of easy things with it. Most dishes you can make and serve will have people asking you what your recipe is, but that's just how easy pulled pork is to work with. So when I say this next sentence, hear it with an open mind. How do you feel about cherry cola pulled pork? Yeah, slow-cooked, barbecue-y, savory pulled pork left to simmer in a pool of cherry cola, barbecue sauce, and other seasonings. The first time I heard of this dish, I struggled just to imagine all of those flavors in one bite. Like, barbecue sauce is a dip, pulled pork is a main dish, and cherry cola is a drink. You're used to having all that separately, right? Despite that, since it was all made from things that were so readily available in most homes, and since it was right up the alley of home chefs in their slow cooking era, it took off in a major way. Especially in the South, where everything involved in this dish is something people were already having on a daily basis. Like cobbler? Then you need to hear about the wonderful blueberry ones everyone used to make in their crock pots. It isn't really a secret that cobbler is an everyday dessert in most American households, and it's been that way for longer than either you or I have been around. It'll stay that way after everyone we know is gone too. Some things are just generational like that. Blueberry cobbler used to be made in crock pots back then to really let it absorb the flavor. And since you could just leave the dessert to bask in the flavors on its own, people started making it so much more. After crock pots went mainstream and most households had one, sales for lots of berries and fruits went up because of how easy it became to make desserts surrounding them. Blueberries definitely weren't an exception, and the best part was that you could make this at any time of the year, and it would still work. Like, you know how some people don't like having hot chocolate outside of winter? You'd never get any concerns like that with a blueberry cobbler. There was always someone ready to eat a whole plate. If we take a small intermission from the dessert side of things and step on over to some hearty, comforting, and homely soups, we'll find a golden recipe lost among the cookbooks of the 20th century that don't get to see the light of day anymore. Pea and ham soup got its name because of how affordable it was. This is probably the cheapest thing on the list to make. Actually, it literally costs just a few cents. All you needed was ham and peas. You'd simmer them in the crock pot with diced ham and some vegetables like potatoes and celery, then slow cook it until the soup got thickened. You'd get this incredibly creamy, lovely soup that was just perfect for winter nights or after a long, exhausting weekend. Maybe you want to ease up on your stomach and eat something healthy for a change, but you still want some familiar flavors to keep you company. A soup like this would be right up your alley. It costs nothing, feels better than most things, and you can make it anytime. You could probably even take a nap and wake up to the scent of the soup slowly cooking, becoming the final product. Osso buco is something that's known for smoothness. The way the meat falls off of the bone, the saltiness of the gremolata, the freshness of that first bite, which is an experience that you have to savor all on its own. If you're like one of those people who loves to try out your local Italian-American cuisine, you'd be doing yourself one hell of an injustice by not ever trying this. The way this dish got popular was because while the dish was originally made only with veal, by the time it hit American soil, it was using substitutes like beef or pork shanks. This made the dish accessible for your everyday Joe who can't afford to spend a lot on vegetables because, bills. Plus, if you add some gremolata, which is a mix of lemon zest, garlic, and parsley, to the dish, then you get a pretty balanced set of flavors that bounce off of each other. This is one of the finest parts of Italian-American cuisine, and it got popular for being a wonderful family meal that can keep everyone content and full. Despite what you might think about chicken cacciatore, it's actually not hard at all. This was renowned as a one-pot meal, basically, the kind of thing you only need to pay minimal attention to. Italian-American cuisine is yet again the star of the show this time, and the interest in food like this was something America really only went through during the post-war period and towards the 70s and 80s. There was this growing national interest in foreign cuisines from the world over. I'm talking the deepest reaches of Mexico and Spain to Italian classics like this one, which you'd normally never even think to fight in an American home. However, dishes like these work so well with the average American's palate that it's a wonder you don't see them. Chicken pieces that get browned and simmered with tomatoes, bell peppers, garlic, and sometimes even wine. Slow cooked until you get a rich, thick sauce and chicken that needs barely any seasoning because it's already oozing with flavor. Simple ingredients, a no-fuss cooking method, and a taste that works for every chicken fan. It's not hard to see how this dish got to where it is, and now, chicken cacciatore is something you regularly find at almost any meat-based restaurant. Way to come from humble beginnings, right? So if you've been following along until now, you can clearly see there's this big pattern with red meat and stews in the crock-pot world. It seems like a lot of dishes tend to gravitate towards this format, so why is that? Things like bœuf bourguignon, otherwise known as a beef brisket, aren't any different. You get a traditional beef chuck that gets slow cooked in red wine, beef broth, onions, and herbs, and you wait until the meat is so soft you barely even need teeth to pull it apart. This dish was one of the highlights of French cooking, which was normally associated with luxury dining but got modified for the everyday home, and I gotta say, I'm so glad somebody came along and did that modifying. I wouldn't know how to act without my weekly fix of beef briskets, especially with how well they make mushrooms stand out. A dish that works well with mushrooms is one you have to hold close to your heart, always. Nothing says an everyday meal like some soup, and nothing helps something survive being an everyday meal like having some ham in it. That was the thought process between the ham hock minestrone, which got so much goodwill with the people because it was one versatile soup. After the recession and the post-war period, there was this nationwide love for food that was practical and could work in many different ways. The population was too accustomed to rationing and making the best use out of everything, so even when times relaxed and the dust settled, with all this new developing technology like crock pots, people still couldn't get out of the habit. That's why things like this work so well. They take a simple format, even simpler ingredients, but give you a full team of flavors that you can write home about. This soup uses ham hock simmered with vegetables and beans. Then you can add pasta or rice, whichever you'd like more. Though traditionally most recipes call for the pasta instead. If something's going to be smoky flavor-wise, you just know it's going to do well in the South, and that's where this soup was made the most. The way you know most of these recipes have been forgotten is because you just don't hear dishes like that anymore. Not in the middle of this pita wrap or burrito bowl world. For example, just take this dish, sticky citrus chicken. Ever heard of something like that? I bet you haven't. Isn't it interesting to think about how just a few decades ago dishes like these were so common? This dish was a modernized take on glazed chicken, which I'm sure you know of. It just wanted to add a citrusy and tangy element to it instead, and that happened because of the mix of honey and soy sauce and citrus fruits, which made the glaze really memorable. Most glazes were either sweet or really smoky, so there wasn't much to go on for fans of the middle, the tangy, and the zesty. This dish was something that filled that void in so many people, because it was a great way to do something new with the same drumsticks and thighs you've always been used to. The best part of it was that you could get a different sauce depending on the fruit you used. Sometimes you could use oranges, but you'd get a different taste altogether if you used lime instead. That's why kids in particular loved this dish, because you could spin it so many different ways and still get an addictive result that works nutritionally too. Beef Ren Dong was a highlight of New York dining. You could go to any neighborhood in Queens that was known for its beef and they would have Ren Dong available, but it wasn't just New York. It was San Francisco and Los Angeles too, and in the former there was the Tenderloin district where meat-based dishes reigned supreme. The 1970s were the peak of beef rendang, and that's because it was around then that it got easy enough to make at home. People could enjoy it without going to a restaurant, thanks to slow cookers. Beef briskets were used to make rendang, but the magic was actually in this spice paste, which consisted of lemongrass, ginger, garlic, chilies, and turmeric. It sounds like a lot, but it's the genuine article, and it's bound to knock you out of the park no matter what dish you apply it to. Rendang is full of warm flavors, and it's as savory gets, plus the caramelized coating on the beef is really the cherry on top. It's usually served with rice, so if you ever feel like eating something out of an 80s animation, you can make some rendang. It comes closer than enough. Speaking of Los Angeles, it was actually one of the first few places in America that started trying out curries from different cuisines and the subcontinent. One of those was green chicken curry, which was a bit dampened to suit the average Caucasian tastes, but retained most of its flavor nonetheless. You can't knock that out of curries unless you want to make a plain gravy and call it a curry. The green chicken curry was something that every household in the 20th century, especially towards the tail end, was trying out. One of the cuisines that was on the agenda for America's global food tour was Southeast Asian cuisine, particularly the flavors of India, where stuff like coconut milk curries is pretty popular. Besides the milk, this used your typical subcontinental spices like turmeric, green chilies, garlic, and eggplants. I might make it sound like this was a food moment specific to LA, But it was also pretty popular in Elmhurst in Queens, where a lot of restaurants focusing on Thai and Southeast Asian cooking were popping up. You could say this curry walked so that the others today could run, because it was one of the first trendsetters. Or, put another way, America's first step into Southeast Asian food. It's 2024, and I'm sure none of you are strangers to the concept of gut health. We have the privilege of having lots of food science and research about this stuff coming out to support these claims and give us a better idea of what to eat and the impact of it all, but back then, people really just had feelings to go off of. The feeling of being refreshed, the feeling of waking up and feeling powerful, charged, clearer, and less bloated. All of that has to do with good gut health, and one of the best ways to take care of yours was with gut-healing chicken soup. From Colorado to Portland, Oregon, Brooklyn, and New York, it was so common to always have a bowl of this soup on the ready. It was a sign of the times. America was becoming aware of its growing obesity issues thanks to fast food culture, diners popping up everywhere, and a generational habit of greasy fried foods, which definitely hit home and feel like the peak of comfort but can never really help you in life. You simmer chicken, most times with the bone in as well, and then make this nutrient-rich broth with herbs and apple cider vinegar. All in all, it's a tasty dish that also makes sure you live easier and longer, so what's not to love here? Let's head on over to mulligatawny soup for a second since we're discussing soups anyway. This is another example of America dipping its fingers into the flavors of the subcontinent, because this is a dish right from the cookbooks of India. It actually became popular during the colonial period of the British, and that's how it first spread to America. Places like Jackson Heights or Berkeley are places loaded with Indian and British communities, street food stalls, and restaurants, so you can always smell mulligatawny soup around the corner. It's aromatic after all, since you have all those curry spices and apple sweetness being put to work. Also, between you and me, anything with coconut milk gives off a scent that really gets around a whole city block. The reason home cooks with crock pots started adapting it into their weekly routine was because despite it being a soup, it's a bit like a stew too, since it's made with a chicken or lamb base. The cream at the end that you add gives it more of a stew-like feeling too, and it's definitely something that American homes that live next to subcontinental communities got used to making. It's a little sad that something so good and tasty has been forgotten though, but here's hoping we see an eventual comeback one of these days. Soups and curries not to your liking? Let's head to the Indonesian side of things, where we can find popular recipes like satay chicken, which used to be headliners for most cookbooks back in the day. Los Angeles has this area known as Thai Town, and San Francisco also has its own Chinatown. I bring these places up because they acted as footholds for dishes and cuisines like these to make a name for themselves and spread to the wider audience in America. Most of the time, these dishes did manage to gain a niche following, but that was the problem. It only ever stayed niche because it never lasted long enough to break into the mainstream. Stuff like this couldn't keep up with the trends of the country, whether because it wasn't accessible enough, like, for example, if you wanted satay chicken, was it really worth it to get up and go all the way to Thai Town from another part of the city? That's why slow cookers were so nice to have around when they eventually did become mass-produced. Satay chicken is usually grilled, but it can be slow-cooked and left to marinate in a sauce made of turmeric, coriander, and lemongrass, as well as chili paste. If you really want to keep it a touch more American, you can always grill it further after the slow cooking since it will be served on skewers, but the dish works great even if you just cook it in a crock pot, and it's a great way to switch up Meatloaf Mondays when the whole family isn't giving the most excitable reaction to that idea. If we step into the history of steamed molasses and bread, then you can see that Maine and Boston are a bit of a central hub for all things related to them. It's part of that New England culture. Baked beans, toast, steamed food, all of that is very common for people there. Molasses extend even further beyond that, because from the 1920s to the start of the 2000s, in a lot of rural and impoverished areas and the nation as a whole during the recession, molasses were the best way to keep your appetite filled and your family fed. You didn't have the luxury of always being able to go get a casserole or whatever shawarma you'd like. Some people only had molasses to work with, and they did their best to turn that into a memorable food experience too. I gotta say, I think they did the job pretty well, especially with how simple this recipe is. You wouldn't think cornmeal, buttermilk, and molasses steamed in a mold left in simmering water in a slow cooker could be so good, or even work just as well as a custard or a pudding. But here we are nonetheless. These ingredients are something you can find in literally any home, and they're always on grocery lists. It doesn't take a lot to get this dish going, and it may be the easiest one on the list so far. It has an extreme earthy sweetness to it, and it was really popular in neighborhoods where the average income was less. Things like ovens weren't something everybody was blessed with, but all the same, that doesn't have to mean they can't enjoy good food either, right? It seems like wherever you go in America, the impact of the French is something you can see from miles away. Some people argue with statements like that, and to them I say, why were so many dishes like coq au vin popular in the middle of the 20th century? Why did Julia Chef literally start a nationwide curiosity for their cooking? Why are there so many restaurants trying to emulate the cuisine? The proof is in the pudding. Either way, there's few cultures that are better for food inspiration than France is, and it makes sense why a cultural melting pot like the United States has always been inclined towards their cooking. From the presidents to the common folk, everyone loves dishes mixed with red wine and that French dazzle we're all so used to. Coq au vin is definitely like that, since you braise a rooster in red wine with mushrooms and bacon, then slow cook it until everything is mixed together. You want the chicken to taste just like everything else you put in with it, to the point where that original gamey taste of the meat gets overpowered. It's got an incredibly robust flavor, and the braising only brings that out tenfold. Places like Delmonico's in New York or many French restaurants in San Francisco would always serve dishes like these, and since slow cookers became a thing, it became accessible for people to make at home too. So here's a cuisine that hasn't made an elaborate appearance on the list so far, which is German cooking. Specifically, we're talking about a proper Schwarzrouladen from Midwestern cities like Milwaukee, which had a big population of German immigrants in the middle of the 20th century. Patriots had casserole Sundays, but German Americans would always have rouladen as a meal at the end of the weekend. At first glance, you would think it's some kind of wrapped beef or gravy dish, but that couldn't be further from the truth. This rouladen usually has pickles, onions, and mustard, and the beef gets rolled in these. These rolls are then browned and braised for a long while in a beef broth gravy, and at the end you pair it off with dumplings and potatoes for a homely dish that hits every base you need it to. You can expect a whirlwind of flavors here. Seriously, it caters to everyone. You got savory from the beef and the gravy. You get tangy notes from the vegetables they put in. And the slow cooking method really shines here because it adds a tenderness to the meat that works well with the thickness of the gravy and the potatoes and dumplings as a side. It's just one of those dishes where everything's an obvious team effort and it works. It's elaborate because it needs to be, not because it's trying to be overly complicated to seem fancy. That's how you know you're about to sit down for a real meal. I'm going to take all of you for a spin through a German's taste buds one last time while I still have you here. Remember how I just went over areas with high amounts of German immigrants? Some of those, like Pennsylvania Dutch country, Chicago, and Baltimore, had this one unique dish that was even a bit of a gate-kept secret back in its heyday. That's sauerbraten, a marinated beef roast in vinegar, sugar, and water with spices that's left for several days. Then it's slow cooked and braised even further and served with a gravy made from the marinade. You get the picture. This is one time-consuming dish. Definitely a commitment. How'd slow cookers change that? It basically cut the entire several-day aspect and turned this into an accessible standalone dish that could make itself really. You'd put it on the crock pot and just pass the hours by as it braised, no need of any attention or supervision. You gotta take what wins you can in life. And a roast that's this easy to make is definitely one worth keeping. Apple pies are arguably the oldest dessert in all of America, so offshoots like apple nut bread pudding obviously got a lot of love too. It was an everyday meal in the same Dutch county we just talked about, and it was a great way of using stale bread without wasting it. Cinnamon and nutmeg were all you needed, and the highlight of this dish, both in the recession and in the post-war period, was that it let you make sure even stale bread in your household was used. Being able to make a meal out of ingredients you thought weren't good anymore is a great way to keep budgets in control and still serve dinner, and that's why this dish got into so many cookbooks. Maybe some of that was a ploy by the government. Maybe it was just everyone being a good Samaritan and passing the knowledge on. Either way, this delicious sweet bread pudding is a lifesaver for many, and slow cooking makes the entire preparation process basically a non-actor. Now, don't you agree that crock pots are the kitchen's magic maker? If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe for more content.